Earlier this year, we did this lengthy series on the Maamar Lehavin Mah Shekasuv BeOtzros Chaim, which is printed in the end of Likutei Torah in Vayikra, in the Hosafos. I think it was 9 or 10 classes, and we covered during the course of that learning a lot of the basic ideas of Kabbalah and Chassidus that deal with Ein Sof, with Tzimtzum Arishin, with Tzimtzum Shalai Kipshutei, with Reshimu, with Kav, all the big ideas or the big concepts or levels that are discussed in Kabbalah, the way they were explained and developed by the Alter Rebbe in this Maamar. We began by talking about the idea of godliness, Ein Sof. We talked about the mashal, the example that's cited in Chassidus to explain Ein Sof is tainug, is delight. We talked about Tzimtzum Harishan, the concept of the first Tzimtzum, which is called Siluk. The light has to be removed altogether. We discussed the idea that Hamoed Hu B'His Galus, that the Tzimtzum affects only the light and doesn't affect God Almighty at all. We discussed that Tzimtzum Harishan is Shaloi Kipshutei, it's not literal, it's figurative. In other words, even the Ein Sof which was removed, it's removed only for us, it's not removed for godliness. We spoke about the Reshimu, that when the first Tzimtzum occurs, there's actually something that remains, the Roshim. We even had a discussion on Oira Reshimu, which is a bit of an unusual discussion. And then we talked about Kav, the proactive reinvestment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in creating the world through the ruled, the measured idea of Ein Sof as opposed to eagle. But we didn't finish the Maamar. We left the Maamar on a cliff. The last 20-something lines we left for now, before Rosh Hashanah. And the reason we did this is because when you learn the Maamar Lehavin Mah Shekasuv BeOtzros Chaim, there's an immediate question that strikes you. And the question is, what's it doing in Likutei Torah in the end of Vayikra? Why Vayikra? Why not Bereshis? Why Vayikra? And the answer is this. The last 20-something lines of this Maamar explain what the Maamar Lehavin Mah Shekasuv BeOtzros Chaim is doing in Likutei Torah and Vayikra. Because it talks about Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, of course, is discussed in Sefer Vayikra, in Leviticus, in Parshas Achrei Mos, and Achrei. And moreover, this Maamar talks not only about Yom Kippur, but actually goes on to talk about Sukkot as well, which is also discussed in Parshas Vayikra, in Sefer Vayikra, in Parshas Emor. So it seems that the link between this, I guess we'll call it classic work, or certainly comprehensive work, of Kabbalah / Chassidus, that addresses so many of the most important ideas that we're so familiar with if we learn Chassidus and Kabbalah, the very end of the Maamar links it to Yom Kippur. And since in Sefer Vayikra Yom Kippur and Sukkot are discussed, apparently the Tzemach Tzedek chose to place it in the Hosafos and Likutei Torah and Vayikra because of its link to Parshas Achrei Mos and Parshas Emor. Incidentally, when I was teaching you these classes, I had the Maamar from the Mittel Rebbe, which is also, it's based on the Alter Rebbe's Maamar Lehavin Mah Shekasuv BeOtzros Chaim. It's also printed in the Vayikra, the Hosafos of Vayikra, and the Maamar of the Mittel Rebbe. But this piece is not there. The conclusion is missing. In other words, the Mittel Rebbe wrote a commentary on the Maamar of the Alter Rebbe, and it's interesting to see that it's this Maamar is actually much longer than the Mittel Rebbe's version, because this is the Tzemach Tzedek's commentary, and that Maamar is the Mittel Rebbe's commentary, and it seems to me almost like the Tzemach Tzedek's Maamar is as long or longer than the Mittel Rebbe's version, which is not usually the way it is. Usually the Mittel Rebbe is far more elaborate, than Tzemach Tzedek is far more concise, but in this case it seems like the Tzemach Tzedek took this Maamar and developed it and wrote it out, so to speak, even more than did the Mittel Rebbe. And as I'm sure you noticed, we skipped the Tzemach Tzedek's notes. We didn't learn the Tzemach Tzedek notes, but we did learn the Tzemach Tzedek's Hanocha, Tzemach Tzedek's writing of this Maamar. The Alter Rebbe didn't write this Maamar. The Alter Rebbe simply said it, and it was written by others. And it seems like the Tzemach Tzedek developed it very, very well. So when you look in the Maamar of the Mittel Rebbe on Vayikra, and you see in the Hosafos of Vayikra This Maamar, it's only there because this is in Likutei Torah in Vayikra, because that Maamar doesn't have the conclusion. If it doesn't have the conclusion, it shouldn't be in Vayikra, it should be in Inyanim or something to that effect, I'm not sure. But as it relates to this Maamar, this is a very, very scholarly, a very haskaladik Maamar as we call it. The conclusion is connected to the Parsha Sefer Vayikra, about Yom Kippur and about Sukkot. So it was decided that we shouldn't finish. And we should wait till we get closer to Rosh Hashanah with Hashem's help. And when we get closer to Rosh Hashanah, we would revisit the Maamar and finish it. And if somebody lost sleep because they were chomping at the bit to get the end of the Maamar, I apologize for making you wait on the one hand, but on the other hand, sometimes waiting for a Maamar Chassidus a little bit is in itself a reward. There's a very famous story with the great Mashpia and Chassid Rebbe, who had two Mashpiyim of his own. His Mashpiyim were Reb Shmuel Ber Bar Yissever and Reb Avram Kejemben. He lived in Jemben. His Mashpiyim was Shmuel Ber Bar Yissever, was the Mashpia in Jemben, and Avram Kejemben was the Rav in Jemben. And he was a Malamed. He was very, very poor. And he came into town for a bris at great personal expense because he wanted to be with his mashpia for the bris, Avram Kejemben. And during the bris, they fabrang together, and at the end of the bris, Avram Kejemben says, I want to tell you a story. And then he said to Reb Greinim, no, I'm not going to tell you the story. And Reb Greinim said to him, you offered to tell me a story, maybe you'll reconsider and tell me. He says, nah. And finally told him, you stay till tomorrow, I'll tell you the story. For Reb Greinim to stay till tomorrow meant he would lose another day of Parnasa, which was real Mesiras Nefesh. But he stayed the additional day to hear the story, and then the next day his mashpia told him, I'm not telling you the story. And he didn't tell him the story. And Reb Greinim used to say he learned so much more, or he got so much more from the story he hadn't heard of all the stories that he's heard. I don't think anybody is as anxious to hear the end of this hemshech as Reb Greinim was to hear that sipur. But it was decided that we postpone it and bring it to the season of Yom Tif and, so to speak, celebrate this effort that we invested in teaching this Maamar, with the understanding that it's not going to appeal to everybody. A lot of people were a little bit lost. But on the other hand, if you see just the comments, there was certainly an element, a class of people, both men and women, that found this Maamar incredibly edifying and useful and educational and clarifying, if you will. And we decided to leave this for Yom Tif so that we could celebrate the conclusion of this incredible effort in the season of Tishrei, in Yom Tovim, in the Meyadim. Now, I will tell you simply the point that links this suffix, this conclusion, to the Maamar as large. This Maamar is very large. I mean, it's 592 lines. Yeah, a good percentage of these are the Tzemach Tzedek's notes, which we didn't teach, but L'Kula Alma, no one is going to doubt, question how large, how massive this Maamar is. And teaching it was quite an undertaking. It was very challenging, of course. The entire connection between this massive Maamar and the Yom Kippur Sukkos context is the Ki'imcha. The Rebbe mentioned in the Maamar, I think it was in our third shiur, the idea of Ki'imcha Makir Chaim. The Maamar started off talking about Gilui of Elokus and Atzilus, and then it started by talking about Ein Sof, which is higher than Atzilus. And one of the ideas which was mentioned towards the beginning of this series was Ki'imcha Makir Chaim. Ki'imcha Makir Chaim means that with Hashem there is the source of life. And the Alter Rebbe interpreted what is the meaning of Makir Chaim. Makir Kol HaTanugim, the source of all delights, is also called Makir Chaim. And we gave a shiur, I believe it was the third, where we talked about Tainug, delight. And we explained why Kabbalah and Chassidus, when wishing to explain the Ein Sof, godliness, uses, amongst other things, the metaphor of delight, of pleasure. And if you can remember that class, you will recall that we discussed the concept of different levels of delight, different levels of pleasure. You can get pleasure from food, you can get pleasure from music, you can get pleasure from feelings, pleasure from ideas, higher and higher and higher pleasures. But in general, pleasures go into categories. One category of pleasure is called Tainig HaMurkav, a pleasure which is grafted or bound to something else which stimulates the pleasure. For example, if you eat food and the eating of this food or the drinking of this wine delights you and gives you pleasure, you're not experiencing pure delight and pure pleasure, you're experiencing delight and pleasure as juxtaposed against food or drink. When you learn a deep and abstract idea and it gives you delight and pleasure, you're not experiencing pure pleasure, you're experiencing pleasure as it's juxtaposed against ideas. There's a level of delight, of tainig, which is called tainig HaPoshet, the experience of pleasure as it is by itself. And of course, we explained at length the connection between pleasure and Ein Sof, so I'm not going to repeat that. But the point that the Alter Rebbe brought out is that the highest and the deepest levels of Ein Sof are like the highest and the deepest pleasures. They're Eino Murkavim. The highest and deepest levels of Ein Sof are not in any way juxtaposed against anything else. I mean, to explain it very plainly, yes? Godliness is juxtaposed against vessels. The Kelim of Atzilus are the Zulas, are the other against which the godliness is juxtaposed, which makes it Ha'ara and Gili of Ein Sof. Godliness is juxtaposed against the Kelim which are even higher than Atzilus. But higher than Atzilus, it's a little bit more edel. So you would call it a Gili of Ein Sof or a Oir of Ein Sof, but you wouldn't call it a Gili and you wouldn't call it a Ha'ara. But even there's two things. There's the godliness juxtaposed against something else. The highest levels of godliness is what we call in our culture Atzmas Aved Ein Sof. Atzmas Aved Ein Sof translates as godliness as it exists by itself. Godliness that is not juxtaposed against anything. In other words, godliness not how it's revealed and reflected off some kind of a vessel, some kind of a reflector, some kind of a world. But godliness that exists alone, this is what we call Atzmas Aved Ein Sof. Godliness as it is by itself. This, of course, is the highest level of godliness. This is godliness of Tzimtzum. And the Pasuk says, Ki imcha mekeir chayim, that with God, secondary to God, and in the presence of God, is mekeir chayim, is the level of godliness, which is mekeir kol ha'tanugim, the source of all delights, the source of all pleasures. In other words, the essence, or the highest level of the Ein Sof, which is, of course, the source of all the lower levels of godliness, which will later develop through the Tzimtzum and being mislabish and elamis and so forth and so on. So this was one of the ideas that was mentioned in this Maamar, that godliness as it exists before the Tzimtzum, before creation, is ki imcha mekeir chayim, it exists alone, kvayachal with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in a way of imcha. So this Maamar says, imcha l'gzeira shava, if you will. You have the pasuk, ki imcha haslicha. That there's a concept on Yom Kippur where the tshuva comes from imcha. And of course the idea is that the same idea of mekeir chayim, which we call imcha, the idea that there's a level of Ein Sof which is atzmos, which exists by itself, is imcha, is tafel and batal HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That level of godliness is the ki imcha aslicha, the power of atonement and forgiveness and correction. That Fayachal, the Eibush that invests in his creation, comes from imcha, comes from the level of godliness which is lifnei hatzimtzum. In other words, and in short, the Maamar is going to make the point that the shadish of the inyan of Yom Kippur and the effectiveness of Yom Kippur, and therefore the way we behave on Yom Kippur, is from Ein Sof Shlefnei HaTzimtzum, the highest levels of godliness. That's the entire link between the Maamar, the mysticism of the Maamar, and this conclusion. Otherwise, it can stand by itself, so to speak, almost as a Maamar unto itself. So, the Alter Rebbe's link between the Yom Kippur and Sukkot ideas that will follow, that we're going to learn tonight with Hashem's help, and the elaborate Maamar about Ein Sof and about Ratzon and about Tzimtzum and about Reshimu and about Eidah Reshimu and about Kav and all the other things, its link to aspect of behavioral Yiddishkeit life is this link to Yom Kippur, that Yom Kippur, every Jew reaches a madrega of Ki Imcha Aslicha. Having made this connection, I want to teach you this Maamar, this shtickle Maamar, these few lines, as a self-standing entity, as if it were a piece by itself. And I'm going to share something with you, which, although we once learned the Melech Basada Maamar, the Anil Dodi Maamar, I don't think I did what I'm about to do when I taught you that Maimer. And even if I did, I don't think you will hold it against me if I were to repeat what I said then, here. But I believe what I'm about to share is novel. Everybody is familiar with the analogy of Melech Basada, the king in the field. It's the king in the field. Yeah. The Rebbe once said to Meir Rabbi Sarah, he was going to some kind of a conference, and it wasn't a conference about Jews, it was about his diet that he's involved with, microbiology, whatever it is, macrobiology. And the Rebbe told him he should speak about Melech Basada. Here he is going to make a speech at a conference about people who are very into health, and he's supposed to talk about the king in the field. So I've heard different versions of the story, but whether he said it once or he said it many times, but he simply got up and he said, you should all know the king is in the field. And of course, all these are New Agers, people who are involved in these special diets that are all a little bit spiritual. And they said, man, what a great concept. The king in the field, that's such a great idea. They didn't necessarily understand how he meant it, but they all heard the king is in the field. I mean, the Rebbe, the king in the field. What the Rebbe didn't make out of the king in the field, I have to tell you that any Lubavitcher growing up today who's so enamored with the king in the field analogy would be so disappointed if you would open up a Likutei Torah and look at it in the original. Because you would find that the way the Alter Rebbe said the mashal and how the Rebbe manipulated the mashal it's not opposite, but it's so far away. The Alter Rebbe uses the mashal for the king in the field in a very narrow way. When you learn the Maimah, the king is in the field is only for Beinanim. Not by Lechuvah, not Rishayim. They're because they're not in the field. They're in the desert. And when you learn the Maimah, you sort of feel like you're not even with the king in the field. You're out in the desert. The Rebbe said the king is in the field, and he has to do it every single Jew. He sort of is saying what the Alter Rebbe said, but he's not saying what the Alter Rebbe said. He's saying what the Alter Rebbe said. The king is in the field, and he's saying that when the king is in the field, Yochelim v'Rashayim kol echad ve'echad, anybody can go and he can speak to the king. U'makabel kulam. Umamara panashechis lakulam, he shows them a smiling face. Umakabel kulam, besave eponim yafas, and he greets them with such a pleasant countenance. The Rebbe never ever mentions that if you're a Rasha, you're not in the field, you're in the desert, and you're not meeting the king. Every Jew meets the king in the field. So although it's the mashal of the Alter Rebbe, but the way the Rebbe celebrated the king in the field, it's a mashal of pure love. The Eibishter comes down into this world in Chassidishe, and he is available to every Jew with so much love and so much attentiveness and so much patience. Even the most remote Jew, even the Jew that in the word of the Alter Rebbe is not in the field himself, in the world of the Rebbe is also, the king is in the field. And this is really the Rebbe's Avas Yisrael and the Rebbe's Rebbe. That it's the same Torah on the one hand, but it's a brand new Torah on the other. Everybody is meeting the king in the field, no matter who they are in Chassidishe, and the whole mashal is so much warmth and so much joy. So everybody knows the mashal of the king in the field. But the mashal of the king in the field is quite scholarly. It's not stamazeh a mashal. It's not just a nice story. It's quite scholarly and has significant repercussions, effects. So in the Likutei Torah, the Alter Rebbe speaks about the king in the field. In some of the Maamarim of the Rebbe, he adds another idea, which I have coined peasants in the palace. That's how I refer to it. If in Elul, the king comes to the peasants in the field, in the Yamim Narayim, the peasants join the king in the palace. But when you understand the mysticism of the mashal of the Melech Basada, you can expand it, you can stretch it out to represent all of Tishrei. In other words, even though the Maamarim don't say everything I'm about to say, but the Maamarim say the Nimshal, say what is all represented in Ruchniistic terms, which, so to speak, when you look back at it, you could say you could stretch the mashal of Melech Basada beyond where the Melech Basada mashal is stretched. What I'm saying, in other words, is I want to tell you the story of the king in the field. But I don't only want to tell you what says in Likutei Torah. I want to tell you what says in Likutei Torah. I want to add what says in the Rebbe's Maamarim, and I also want Mederech Efsher to extend the mashal of Melech Basada through what we would call Sukkos, Simchas Torah, and so forth. And after I give you the mashal of Melech Basada entirely, I'm going to give you the entire mashal. And like I said, certain parts of it say in the Maamarim, and some part of it I'm inventing. And if that turns your stomach, you can, as they say in the real world, turn the channel. Then I'm going to give you the nimshal to all of the steps of Malach Basada, and the nimshal is in Chassidus, that I'm not making up. Like I said to a friend of mine on the way to tonight's class, I'd love to be able to make it up, I'm simply not smart enough. And then we'll learn the Maamar. So, although we're learning this Maamar as the conclusion to Lehavin Mah Shekasuv BeOtzros Chaim, we're going to create from it also a charge for Chodesh Tishrei, for the Yom Ne'roim and Tishrei, although it is certainly the conclusion of the Maamar we just learned, and the idea of Kimcha Meker Chaim, which is the concept of Kimcha Slicha, which is connected to Yom Kippur. So here goes. Let's talk king in the field, Melech Basada. What's the story of the king in the field? And I'm saying this again. People correctly tell me, sometimes they send it online, sometimes they ask me in person, what's your source? Where did this come from? Some of what I'm going to say I have sources for. Some of what I'm going to say is developed, is what are they called? A darshan's license, if you will. But the nimshal, what it all means in Ruchnizik terms, is all from Chassidus. It's not mine at all. The story of the king in the field is very simple. You have a society. And a society consists of many classes. At the pinnacle, at the height of the society is the king, obviously, who is surrounded by very intelligent people who are very creative and with a lot of foresight and with a lot of responsibility. They need to keep the society functioning. And for the society to function, the systems that are in place have to be sustained, and they also need to be enhanced. Things need to constantly improve, right? The Rebbe always says the sign of a living thing is growth. Something stops to grow, it's dying. So the king surrounds himself with these ministers who are very, very smart. They're given tasks, they're given areas to be expert at, and together they collectively counsel the king in governing the country. The king is, of course, involved in everything and everyone, but he can't do it all by himself. He has all this support. Around the palace, the king and the officers and the ministers, you have the professionals, the people who are involved in sophisticated kinds of work that provide the society with finer and more sophisticated needs. And of course, in any society, you're going to have the peak, the pinnacle, and you're going to have all kinds of levels until you have simple folk, simple people who are doing simple things. They too are vital. No society, just like a society can't live without pearls, a society can't live without bread. At the bottom of the totem pole, those people on the lowest levels are the farmers. They don't even live in the city. They live out in the hills and the fields. But they feed everybody, including the king himself. And if the farmers would cease to feed people, everybody would starve, including, so to speak, Vayachol, the king himself. So farmers may be simple people, may have a simple life, but their contribution to the greater society is far beyond anything they could fathom as farmers. And the king knows this. The king knows this well. The king knows this absolutely, that those farmers out in those villages and fields are, in a very substantial, very real way, the heartland, the basis for the entire society, even though their contribution is so low in terms of the various levels of contribution to the society and civilization, but their contribution fills the bellies of people, and people can't eat, people can't function. And accordingly, the king has a special eye for those farmers, as remote as they are geographically and intellectually from the king, because of their very, very, very important role in keeping the society going. Now, this king is a king, which means to say he rules by remoteness, by almost a sense of intimidation. He doesn't get close to people, never gets intimate with people, everything is distant. And he preserves his power over the society through that mystery, through that distance, through that lack of availability. Even the closest ministers to the king are always unsure when they enter into his palace what they're going to find, because the king never lets anybody get too close. Because the king understands that he must maintain an aura around himself of supremacy, even in some way like superhuman kind of, that there should be a certain honor for his position, an honor for him, because honoring him and honoring his position is the very foundation of civilization. If the kingdom, if the government breaks down, people will eat each other alive in the street. And he's especially particular about the people closest to himself. Those people closest to himself are the most intelligent, and they're the most likely to consider overthrowing the king and taking his position. And the king is very careful to use them, but to make sure it's very clear that he's the king and they're the subjects. The only group of people the king is not afraid to get intimate with are the farmers. Because the king knows that they're in their wildest dreams, they're not going to be kings. They don't have such aspirations. They have no dreams like this. So the king visits the farmers in the fields. He'll never come to the guild of artists. He'll never come to a committee of doctors, because they may have delusions of grandeur that they can question the king's fallibility and so forth. But the farmers, they're simple people. So the king can afford to engage with the farmers in a way that he could never engage with the higher classes of society, who would in fact understand them much better. So once a year the king leaves his palace and he goes out into the field. But when he leaves his palace, he leaves the whole tumult of royalty behind. He doesn't come into the field with a marching band and with an honor guard. He comes alone. And he comes alone, not dressed in royal garb. He looks around what the farmers are wearing, and he buys himself a set of dungarees, of overalls, except that his don't have any grass stains. And he shows up in the field. The farmers look up and they see a strange farmer, dressed in farmer's garb, but he has no grass stains and so forth. He doesn't have the rugged farmer-like look. And soon people are starting to whisper that this is the king. So they argue. The kings don't look like this. Kings have to be all dressed up. Kings have to be surrounded by an entourage. This is no king. And other people saying, no. It's true that kings are supposed to be all dressed up, and kings are supposed to be surrounded by an entourage. But this is nevertheless the king. Okay, once it's determined that it's the king, so now you have smart farmers and foolish farmers. The smart farmers drop what they're doing and they run to the king and they hang around. Why? The king is wise. And the king gives them counsel about their lives and about their careers, about their businesses and about their farms. He can advise them about what they should farm for the benefit and the betterment of the society and so forth. And they put aside their work and they spend all this time with the king, trying to take as much as they can from the king's wisdom, so that when the king leaves, they'll be better farmers. They'll provide better for their families. And more importantly, or also very important, they'll be able to provide better for their societies. The foolish farmers say the king is not forcing us to come see him. When he comes with a parade and a uniform, everyone has to come out. He doesn't mind if we ignore him, so we have work to do. Some of these foolish farmers never make it to the king. Some foolish farmers make it to the king for the weekends, for Shabbos. Some come once in the month. But the king is in the field. And the king is mingling with the simplest people, with the lowest class of people. They're never going to overthrow him. On the one hand, he's providing bread for the society on the other. So the king comes to the field. And they hang around with him, the farmers, and they become his friend. And here is this brilliant man hanging around with the simplest folk. And there's such a meeting of the mind. There's so much love between the farmers and the king. And at a certain point, the king says, okay, I'm going home. And the peasants say, how could you abandon us? You came to our midst. You taught us so much wisdom. You raised us up so high. And are you going to leave us? So the king says to these farmers, my children, the only reason I came to you is because you're supposed to make bread. You're the farmers, and you may see your role as ordinary, simple, but what you provide for the civilization is most critical. I'm going back to my palace, and you'll stay in the fields. But it doesn't happen so simple. When the king returns to the city, there is a parade. And the people from the city come to greet the king as he's coming back into the city from his sojourn, from his visit to the field. So you have the city folk coming out to greet the king, and you also have the farmers following the king. And there's a parade. They march down the busiest boulevard in the city towards the palace. And you have all these big machers, the king's council, and then you have all the professionals and all the academics, and then you have the farmers. Everyone is going to accompany the king back to the palace. When the king comes to the door of the palace, he announces, nobody can go beyond this point, but the farmers who hosted me for the last 30 days can enter into my palace, and now I will host them. So the people from the city never see the inside of the palace. The farmers not only see the inside of the palace, they see the inside of the king himself who visits them out in the field, and how he invites them in to spend time with the palace. So these farmers, they pile into the palace. Now, of course, a palace and farmers is a bad match, especially if they're coming for more than a 15-minute visit, They touch something and it breaks. They look at a picture, it falls off the wall. They totally unsophisticated and unschooled in how you're supposed to behave, the etiquette of a palace, the sounds, the smells, the taste, the order, the grandeur, the beauty. It's all overwhelming to them. And they're having a very difficult time being acclimated in the palace, because in the palace, you have to behave. A farmer out in the field can be a farmer. In the palace, you have to be on your best behavior. And these farmers are so unconditioned to being controlled and disciplined and serious, but they're in the palace. So those farmers who were wise enough to spend the 30 days with the king while he was in the field are much more conditioned to adapt to the mode of conduct, to the behavioral paradigms of the palace. Those who were foolish enough not to spend time with the king are much, much more uncomfortable. But everybody is in the palace, and the king continues his love affair with the farmers, but in a very different way. He's no longer chum-chum. Now he's on the throne, he's all dressed up, and he's very, very awesome. And he allows the peasants into his presence based on the presumption that they are going to treat him with awe. No more buddy-buddy, no more friend, no more chavalap. I'm the king. And these farmers have to figure out how to adapt to a world of such exactness and such awe. When they're simple people, they're not exact, they're certainly not people who are filled with fear, they're filled with joy or with simplicity. But they figure it out. And they break a few things, they make a few people upset, but eventually they learn the etiquette of the palace and they figure out how to stand in the presence of the king, and they're good at it, and they're enjoying their new place in the society. And just about when they finally figured it out, the king says, okay, now everybody go home. Go home. Go back to the fields. Make bread. And they said, Enenu HaMelech, your majesty, you clearly love us. You singled us out. You lowered yourself to our world. You raised us up into your world. Why would we want to go back to the farms and to the fields? We'd like to stay here in the palace. And of course, the king's answer is very plain. If I didn't think that you would go back to the fields to farm, I would never visit you in the first place. The only reason I embraced you, the only reason I gave you this special love, the kind of warmth and attentiveness and intimacy that I would never give the professionals and the ministers and the council, is because you may be the lowest class of people, but your role is most critical. You feed everybody, including the king himself. So all of this embracing, me descending to your level and me raising you up to mine, was a means for you to go back to your fields and do your thing. So they leave the palace. What happens when you leave the palace? You come to the parking lot. I don't know if there were parking lots in the century of the allegory, the metaphor, but visualize this, yeah? And they have to go home. But nobody told them when they have to reach the fields. So they go out of the palace. They consider this incredible closeness the king showed them, and they decide that they're going to celebrate. They're going to celebrate this love, this incredible closeness. The king came to them, he brought them into his world, they've been sent back. They're going to celebrate this intimacy, this attention, this favoritism. So they stand outside the parking lot of the palace, and they do what farmers do best. Nobody's awed and nobody's serious. It's full of joy and full of love and full of happiness. And they celebrate and they sing and they dance and they sing and they dance and they celebrate for a whole week. What an opportunity. The king favored us. Until they can't dance anymore. They're exhausted. And they stop to dance. This singing and dancing is for these farmers very, very important. Why? They are really not able to fully appreciate what the king has done for them. what it means that a king has taken a bunch of zhlobs and made them his buddies. Not only made them his buddies in the sense that he hangs around with them, but that he's raised them up to a dignified level, to a level of knowing how to behave in a palace, to being sophisticated and being dignified and so forth. But the peasants are not conditioned for this kind of exactitude, and it's overwhelming to them. However, when they celebrate through song and dance, which is the language of the peasants, you don't have to be a smart person to dance. What the king gave them, the impact of that gift is driven home. In other words, they don't fully appreciate what happened until they translate what they experienced in the palace into a language which is familiar for them, which is the dancing and the singing. And they don't fully appreciate that until they stop. They stop dancing and singing. They stop because they can't dance anymore. When they stop and they contemplate what just happened, it enters into the mind, wow, the king didn't just invite us into his palace. He empowered us. He gave us a piece of himself. And we're taking this piece of him back with us to the fields. But we're not going to take from the king that awe. We're not awesome. We're not holy. But we will take the joy. And when they appreciate how this celebration of joy is simply the translation of the awe the king gave them in the palace, they're so ingratiated, they're so indebted, they're so happy that they dance a second time. But there's a very big difference between the first dance and the second dance. The first time they're dancing, they're reacting to what the king gave them. The second time they're dancing is they're reacting to their appreciating what the king gave them, acknowledging, absorbing, taking in how fortunate they've been. And they sing and dance, and then they go back to their farms and fields, and they stay there until the king visits them again, and then the cycle repeats itself. Not everything I just said says in Chassidus, and I don't want to pretend it does. But what follows does say in Chassidus. Elul is the time of the king in the field. The king in the field is Ani L'Daidi V'Daidi Li. God Almighty goes down from his level and he engages with the Jewish people on our level. What that means is that in the month of Elul there is an incredible closeness between man and God. The incredible closeness between man and God is such that it is in theory equal to Yom Kippur. Just like Yom Kippur is the revelation of the 13 attributes of mercy, the Arizal says that in the month of El there's a revelation of the 13 attributes of mercy, but there's one basic difference. On Yom Kippur, we almost don't have a choice. The power of the 13 attributes of mercy, which was revealed in the Yom Ne'roim and in Yom Kippur in particular, so strong, it draws even a Jew in who doesn't want to be drawn in. But in Elul, Hashem comes into our world. If we choose to ignore him, we will never feel like we missed anything. But if we choose to pay attention to him, we'll be raised up. Elul is a special month. It's a holy month. All Jews are on a higher level in Elul. And when Elul comes and the king is in the field, it's a time of rachamim, of compassion and mercy. It's also a time of cheshbon nefesh and tshuva, but at the base of it all, it's a time of Ani L'Daidi V'Daidi Li. God Almighty comes to us. If we take advantage of Elul, we see the incredible extra koyches that Elul provides. If we fail to take advantage of Elul, we don't feel like we missed anything because it's a subliminal effect. The king is in the field wearing dungarees. If you choose to ignore him, you didn't ignore anything. You ignored a new farmer on the block, so to speak. But as Elul turns into Tishrei, the Eibishter goes back to the palace and he invites us with him into the palace. And the Yom Ne'roim, the Aseres Yamim Shebein Shana Yom Kippurim, is called in Chassidus Kiruv Amoyer Alanitus, a proximity of the source to the spark. In the Lashon Gemara, B'chol Karenu Elov, Elu Asara Yom Shebein Reish Shana Yom Kippurim, that Hashem is closer to us during the 10 days in Shana Yom Kippur. And the Gemara also explains that therefore, Kan V'Yachet Kan B'Tzibur, during the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, there is a very powerful presence of Hashem in this world, and the power of one Jew in prayer during this time is equal to the power of 10 Jews of a whole minyan during the duration. And during the Yamim Nerayim, we are in a palace. Now, we don't belong in a palace, we're peasants, which explains a few very strange halachas. And one of them is that during the Yamim Nerayim, people take on extra chumras and extra hidurim, extra strictnesses, extra stringencies, which they're going to drop afterwards. Now, that doesn't make sense. It's hypocritical. You take on an extra standard of Yiddishkeit, then you drop it. It doesn't make sense. But when you understand that you are in a special place, and therefore there's an expectation of a special conduct, it becomes understandable that during this time I'm going to take on extra chumras, and then when this time passes, I'm going to abandon those chumras, because I'm not ready for them. I only took them on because I was in the palace. Now there's much to say about Rosh Hashanah and about Kiyas Shefer, but I want to mention Yom Kippur. The height of the peasants in the palace is, of course, Yom HaKadosh, the holy day of Yom Kippur. And of course, the Gemara says, Rebbe brings it down, of course, the halacha is like Chachamim, but the Rebbe is also right, Itzu Meishal Yom Mechaper. Yom Kippur's ultimate holiness is not what we do, it's the day itself. We do tshuva on Yom Kippur. But the Yom Kippur date itself reveals a level of tshuva, reveals a level of godliness which is far beyond our tshuva. And it makes our tshuva into something much more. In other words, if tshuva means to come close to God, how close can we get? But if tshuva means to come close to God, and God comes close to us by Himself, our ability to come close to Him is increased, is enhanced many, many, many times. And Yom Kippur, in the Welt, Yom Kippur is about Avedis and about tshuva. It's true, it is. Yom Kippur is the day that a Jew is closer to God than he'll ever be in the rest of the year. There is no day, not before and not after, that you're closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you feel closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Chassidus says you're close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu even if you don't want to feel it, and so forth and so on. And then you blow shofar, Shana B'Yerushalayim, and the king turns around and says, go home. V'yakev ha'olach l'darkei. It says in Chassidus that this starts Matzah Yom Kippur. Go home. Now if these farmers, if we would turn around after Yom Kippur and go back to our daily lives, you know what would happen? I'll tell you exactly what would happen. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur would have been an amazing experience, very meaningful. But it would have no bearing on the rest of our lives. There'd be no carryover. But that's not the way it works. You leave the palace and you have Sukkot. Sukkot is a week of celebration. Joy, plain simple joy. Zman Simchaseinu. Says Chassidus, it's a mind from the Baal Shem Tov, that the joy of Sukkot is equal to the tshuva of Yom Kippur. To use the Teres of Baal Shem Tov, the Kohen Gadol goes into the Holy of Holies and he makes a cloud of smoke. That cloud of smoke becomes the Anani HaKoved of the Sukkah, becomes the Schachar of Sukkah. The Yechida Makif, the Yechida energy of Yom Kippur in the Holy of Holies becomes the Sukkah, with a very basic difference. That now we're not celebrating it by sitting still and being in a straitjacket and being so afraid of making a wrong move, but by overflowing, by effervescent, by infinite celebrating. Ashreinu, how fortunate are we? We were with the king in the palace. But that joy doesn't only celebrate what they had, that joy expresses what they took with them, what they have, but in kava simcha as opposed to in kava yira, like it says in a yem yem. In joy as opposed to in awe. Now to break it down, there's several steps. There's the joy of Beis HaShe'eva, there's the joy of the Sukkah, and there's the joy of the Lulav. And the Chassidus behind it is that the Sukkah embraces, it's makif. The Lulav you bring to your heart, which means you take the bakif and you internalize it. I'm sure you know in the Pesach Maimarim, we talk about Amunah, and that Pesach is the Chag Amunah, the holiday of faith. And we say, Eina tinik yedeh likres abba ad sheyitem tam dogan. Children lack the maturity for certain things until they eat bread. And Chassidus says, why bread? Because bread gives das. On Sukkot you also have the same idea, but now it's the lulav. The lulav produces tmarim, dates. Dates in halacha are considered mazon, bread, but the le'idin l'tainu. And when you take the lulav and you bring it to your heart, and of course in Chabad, the key shaking is not the shaking away like it is in the world, to push away ruch Israel, but bringing it to your heart. You're taking the sukkah and bringing it to your heart, which is why we're so particular to shake the lulav dafke in the sukkah. You are internalizing the joy of Sukkot, which comes from the awe of Yom Kippur, and bringing it down into your heart. Shmini Atzeres, you stop. It's a pause, it's an interruption. But it's not the pause, like the end of a piece of music. It's the pause like the middle of a piece of music, where the pause itself is a melody. And the melody of Shmini Atzeres is the ability to take in what's taken place and to appreciate how wonderful it is, and to actually consciously accept it, or consciously, so to speak, commit to do what this inspiration gave. And after Shmini Atzeres is Simchas Torah. You dance again. But now the dancing is not reacting to what the king gave you. You're dancing because you appreciate what you're taking home. That's why the Simcha of Simchas Torah is a Minig Yisrael, which is even higher than Teresh B'Ksav and Teresh B'Zovath, which is much higher than the Simcha of Chag HaSukkos. And then, of course, after Simchas Torah, V'Yayin Gav Halach Adarke, safe, kol safe, the farmers got to go back to the fields. And we're the farmers. Because our Torah and our mitzvahs feeds all of Seder Ishtalshlos, including, like it says in some Midrash Chazal, the Eibishter himself. So I gave you the Moshel of Melech Basad. I didn't need to, but I chose to. Now we're going to learn the Maimer. The Maimer does not discuss Melech Basad at all. It discusses Tishrei. It doesn't even discuss all of Tishrei. It discusses certain parts of Tishrei. Nevertheless, this background of the Moshel of Melech Basad that I gave you is very, very helpful in not so much in understanding what's written here, in as much as it's giving you meaning to what's written here. So let's learn it now. V'achar kol hanal, and taking into consideration all the things that we learned, and at the heart of it, at the essence of it, we had the idea of ki imcha meker chayim, that there is a inyan of godliness, which is imcha, which is godliness as it is alone, the essence of godliness, which is not in any way qualified because it's revealed in any world, but it is as it is in its essence. Yesh lahovin k'tas, we can explain a little bit in Yom Kippur and V'Sukkos, the themes of Yom Kippur and Sukkos. Hine mavu elamayla, we explained at length above, bepirush ki imcha haslicha, that there is a notion that atonement and forgiveness comes from imcha, from this that is completely secondary to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Imcha doesn't mean God. It means what is with God. Tafel, a bottle, shu bechinas ki imcha meker chayim. This is the level of godliness, which is called the source of all life, which is also imcha, tafel, and bottle to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, this is the level of godliness, which is makeda, tanugim, the source of all the lights. On Yom Kippur, the presence of godliness, which is the basis for the Tzimtzum Shel Yom Mechaper, like I explained to you before. Yom Kippur is not only the day that we do tshuva and God forgives us, much more importantly, according to Chassidus, it's a day of meeting, of intimacy between Yid and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's no equal. The essence of the Jew, the deepest level within us, is meeting the truth of godliness in a way of intimacy that's so powerful, like the Rebbe says in the Siches, that Avedas don't exist there. It's not that you have to do tshuva for Avedas, it's Avedas don't exist there. On Yom Kippur you have to do tshuva also, because we don't paskan like Rebbe. Without tshuva, Yom Kippur doesn't work. But the idea of Yom Kippur is when you're this close to God, the Aveda never happened. The tshuva allows you to be in that space, but the tshuva is a means to an end. What happens on Yom Kippur is how close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a Yid, ki imcha. He meets that level of godliness called makeda ta'anugim, in other words, Ein Sof Shlefnei Tzimtzum, where there is no sin at all, and therefore the Yom Kippur, the tshuva is imcha aslich. And the Rebbe says, and I'm skipping to the next line, 571. And therefore, on Yom Kippur, we deprive ourselves of 5 things of pleasure. Now, of course, some people think that Yom Kippur you have to deprive yourself of all these things to suffer as part of the tshuva. Says Alter Rebbe, that's not the case. But rather, you separate yourself from these 5 things because on Yom Kippur you're so close to God Almighty that you're above these kind of secondary delights. Any kind of pleasure, short of the pleasure of being one with God, which is represented by Yom Kippur. It's not experiencing pleasure or godliness as it is by itself, but rather it's experiencing pleasure or godliness, which is murkav, which is juxtaposed against the food or the drink or whatever the case is. Aval Yom Kippurim, but on the day of Yom Kippur. Ayadei HaTshuva, through the preparation of Tshuva. And again, Yom Kippur is not about the Tshuva. Yom Kippur is about that as a result of the Tshuva, there is the Tzimtzum, Yom Mechaper. So through our tshuva, me'eded, we arouse atzmas itself, godliness as it is by itself. In other words, godliness lifnei tzimtzum, which creates an intimacy between Yidin HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which has no equal during the year. And skip 2 lines to 574. V'zeu ki imcha slicha. This is explaining the idea that on Yom Kippur, the tshuva and the kapara and the slicha comes from the madrega of imcha, godliness as it is by itself. And therefore also Yisir Karas. It's prohibited, and prohibited in such a way that if Chas v'Shalom a person partakes, he loses his connection to Hashem in the process, in eating and drinking and so forth. Hey, all 5 of the things which normally delight a person are not allowed on Yom Kippur. In other words, we separate ourselves midvodim, gashim, from physical things. Rak lehiyes, to be in a constant state of os tisanig al havaya, we're experiencing a delight from the level of godliness which is al havaya, in other words, even higher than the godliness which comes down into shem havaya. The God of the shem havaya is eslapshus and oisis and kalim. The level of Yom Kippur is even higher than that. In other words, like we always are taught in the Sichas, Yom Kippur you don't fast. Yom Kippur you're higher than eating. Now of course, at the end of Yom Kippur, most of us feel hungry because we're not big tzaddikim. But the concept of Yom Kippur is that food and the need to be nourished from something outside of ourselves is a lower level. When you experience this kind of oneness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, all you need is the oneness. You need nothing to translate it. You need no food, no drink, no anointing, and so forth. V'chein, accordingly, Bigdei Lehavin, with the white clothing of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, also mirrors the sense of holiness and imcha, oneness with Atzmos and Hus, which Yom Kippur represents. Because ki gavin lavin or gavin atzmi, the color white is an absolute color. She'enei murka, which is not the product of a composition of different aspects. Now, I don't know what the physics of this is, but according to Chassidus, we all know that the difference between white and black is that white is every color of the rainbow, and black is 0 color. And of course, in physics, we talk about colors being light, wavelengths of light. The way it's understood in Chassidus is that this table is a very dark brown, it's almost a black, yeah? If you took a piece of this table and you made it small enough, the brown would disappear. You wouldn't be able to see it. Anything which is colorless is white. In other words, the idea that you'll look at something and you'll see a color other than white has to do with the relationship between the light and the object. And again, the physics is that the object absorbs certain wavelengths and it reflects certain wavelengths back, and as a result you see a color. In other words, colors are not really there. This is not really brown. It's the light plus the pigment in the table which is absorbing the other wavelengths that's allowing me to see the brown. So according to Chassidus, colors by nature are a harkava. Colors in essence don't really exist. Colors are the relationship between light and something other. If there is no relation between light and something other, what is everything? Not black, but white. That's how it is alpitated. It's white. So white represents an absoluteness higher than a color which represents a meaning of 2 things. Because on Yom Kippur, there's only one, there's only God. And therefore we can explain a third idea. Mah Shekasuv Shabbos. Yom Kippur is called the Shabbos of all Shabbos, which means it's even holier than Shabbos. Hu lachem, and therefore, not in spite of this, but therefore, v'nisim es nafshei, you have to punish your souls. The question is obvious. That Shabbos, we all know that on Shabbos mitzvah, and Shabbos it's a mitzvah. In fact, it's not only permitted, but it's encouraged to eat and drink and to get delight. And it's called Shabbos. And Yom Kippur is the Shabbos of all Shabbos. In other words, Shabbos, it's even more Shabbos-like than Shabbos itself. You should for sure eat and drink. Why does the Torah say, don't eat and drink? And the answer is because when you eat and you drink, you get pleasure. from food. Now, if the food happens to be holy, like on Shabbos, it's a holy pleasure. But it's not a pure pleasure. It's not an experience of the Ein Sof as it is by itself. It's an experience of the Ein Sof that's juxtaposed against something else. Ella Inyan, the answer is, Ki Shabbos, because the regular Shabbos, it's a very high level. It's the level of Chochmah. Hainu Bechinas Chochmah Nikre Eidin. It's the level of Chochmah, which is called Eidin. But it's V'hatainug hamislabish b'chochmah. You have at least two ideas. You have the idea of Chochmah and the godliness or the delight that comes from that Chochmah. And therefore, Harehu Aderech Mashal, it is using the idea which we discussed, like I said before, I think in the third class of this series. Hislapshos v'harkovas hatainug. Shenislabish li hatainug min ha'chochmah. It's a juxtaposition. It's a composite of wisdom and the delight of wisdom, and therefore it's not pure delight. And in the Nimshna, it's not pure Ein Sof. And accordingly, ve'ein zeh kamei makeirat tanugim. It's not like the highest level of Tainug, it's not the highest level of Ein Sof, because we know that the highest Tainug is Tainug HaPoshut, and the highest Ein Sof is Atzmos Ein Sof. She'ein ha'Tainug midav v'shachut mimenu. The delight is from nothing outside of itself. The Ein Sof is not related to anything other than itself. Therefore, when it comes to Shabbos, since Shabbos, although it's Chochmah, it's Tainug HaMurkav, Gam Lamata, in this world, the mitzvah becomes Lihisaneg b'mayachal b'mishta, to be delighted by eating and drinking. Ki kein Chochmah b'ina nikro ichlu reidim. There's a pasuk ichlu reidim shtu v'shikru deidim. Deidim goes on Zohar and Malchus, reidim goes on Chochmah and Bina, and in Chochmah and Bina and Zohar and Malchus you have to eat and drink. It's Tainug HaMurkav. Avo b'chinas Shabbos Abbas Ne'em Kippur, and then comes Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, a Yid experiences Kimcha Meker Chayim, Kimcha Slich, an intimacy with godliness. He's experiencing what the Rebbe calls Mekeirat Tanugim. He's experiencing what the Rebbe calls Atzmos Ein Sof, Bechinas Kimcha Meker Slich, the level of godliness which is batal to Hashem. Kimcha Meker Chayim, Lachain, therefore also that Tainug b'maychal b'mishta. There's no need to, and therefore it's not allowed to eat and drink, because you don't want to experience a complex delight or a complex representation of the Ein Sof. If you can have the Pashata, the Atzmi is the representative of the Ein Sof. And therefore you don't eat and drink, Kihu, because the day of Yom Kippur is Gilui Mekeirat Tanugim, a revelation from Ein Sof, which is the Mekeirat Tanugim, or Atzmos of Ein Sof Shalamai, Lemechachma Kenedi, which is beyond any kind of Harkava. In other words, the Atzmos of godliness, and therefore you're above eating and drinking. This is Yom Kippur. So again, the mystical model is that in Yom Kippur you don't fast. On Yom Kippur you're above eating and drinking because you're so one with Hashem. So you're higher than a need to connect to Hashem through a medium, through something other. And then we go to line 588. V'hine acher kach. Then afterwards. You have the days of awe, the holiest days of the year. Peasants in the palace. Then the king says, go home. But the peasants are smart. They go out into the parking lot. Yeah, you have king in the field, peasants in the palace, peasants in the parking lot. Yeah, what happens? They celebrate. They translate the incredible, potent experience of intimacy that they had with the king in the palace into a language of peasants, the language of peasants of joy. It says, I think even in Hayom Yom, that the same lukus, the same yechida, which you have in the Yom Neraim and Kavayira, you have in Sukkot and Kavasimcha. It's the same connection to Hashem, but now you're celebrating it in a language which ordinary people can value. Joy. Then comes Sukkot. It's brought down into the person that you're surrounded by this joy, which is the Sukkah. And then, you internalize this surrounding godliness, which under by the Kav, as you'll see soon, that's to do with the Lulav. Therefore, Chalal Sukkah, the space of the Sukkah is Ades Remama is till 20 cubits, Bechinas Kesed. Because 20 Amos goes on Kesed, and the idea of the Simcha of Sukkah is the Simcha that comes from Kesed higher than Chachma, which is why it's Tainug HaPoshut. V'hainu, in other words, Idea Sukkah, through the Sukkah, Nimshach Bechinas Asheras HaMakifim. We bring down the presence of God that is on a level that embraces and envelops. But inside this Sukkah, according to Minhag Chabad, we shake the Lulav. Vayedei Dalad Minim Shabalulav, then we shake the Lulav. And I explained to you before that the key to the Lulav is the Lulav itself, which is the branch from which Tmarim, which means dates, grow. And dates are mazon, just like wheat is mazon. So it provides das to internalize the connection to Hashem, which we receive during El and the Yom Neraim and Sukkot. Shem Shor Shamidal Adesias Hashem, the 4 species of the lulav, correspond to the 4 letters of Hashem's name, and this is the same idea as the Shem Havaya, which is after Yom Kippur. It's a higher Shem Havaya, and that is Nim Shach. It's drawn down lahar b'pchnimis pimi, to internalize. Liyes b'chin is da, that our relationship to the Eibush shouldn't simply be one of understanding, but one of knowledge. And knowledge means connection and certainty. As the God of your father. V'avdei you believe Shalom, and serve Him and worship Him with a whole heart. V'nefesh chafetz v'chol, a desiring soul. And the key here is the word das. Like the Maamar Chassidishe say, David HaMelech is laying on his deathbed and he's talking to his 12-year-old son and successor Shlomo HaMelech. He tells him, Das Elokei Avicha. David knew how smart Shlomo was. And he knew that Shlomo needed no help with intelligence. But he said, you can be the smartest man in the world and you can be lost. You need connection. That what you understand should be real. And for this you have to have das. And this is what the lulav internalizes from the makif of the sukkah, which, like I said to you before, comes from the anan akteres of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, linking the Yemei HaYira with the Yemei HaSimcha. And let me just conclude that there's really a source for all of this in the Gemara, you should know. The idea that Sukkot is a hemshech to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and not just a separate holiday that happens to coincide. What do they sing by Simchas Beis HaSheva? Simchas Beis HaSheva was the greatest joy. What do they sing? They sang about Tshuva. The tzaddikim used to say, Ashrei Yalduseinu, Asher Zikaseinu Shleibichas Yalduseinu. We are fortunate about our older years that did not embarrass our youth. And the Baalei Tshuva used to say, Ashrei Ziknaseinu Shekipras Yalduseinu, that our elder years atoned for our youth. And Elu ve'elu Eimrim Ashrei Mi Shalei Chato Mishachata Yashav. These and these would say it's better not to sin. And if we could sin, thank God we could do tshuva. In other words, thank God for Yom Kippur. And I want to wish you a ksiva v'chasim tova.